Most celebrities have a public personality. Jim Carrey has hundreds. For years, interviewers, actors, and even some of Hollywood's biggest stars have made the same mistake. They thought they knew what Jim Carrey was going to do next. They never did. Because the moment Jim Carrey enters a room, normal rules stop applying. A conversation becomes a performance. A question becomes a character. And before anyone realizes what's happening, Jim Carrey has completely transformed the moment. So how did one actor become Hollywood's most unpredictable celebrity? At first glance, Jim Carrey looks like a comedian. A very talented comedian, a very successful comedian. But that description doesn't really explain what makes him different. Because Jim Carrey doesn't seem interested in simply telling jokes. He's interested in becoming them. While most celebrities walk into a room as themselves, Jim walks into a room as possibilities. One moment he's answering a question, the next moment he's doing an impression. A strange voice. A completely different character. Or something nobody saw coming. That's why interviews with Jim Carrey rarely stay normal for long, because Jim isn't reacting to the conversation. He's transforming it. And once that starts happening, everyone else is forced to keep up. Long before Jim Carrey became a movie star, he had already figured out something unusual. Most comedians use words to get laughs. Jim used movement, expressions, voices, and a level of physical control that seemed almost impossible. That's what made him stand out. He didn't just tell audiences that a character was nervous, excited, confused, or terrified. He became those emotions. His face stretched, his body moved, his voice changed, and suddenly it felt less like acting and more like watching a living cartoon. That's why early Jim Carrey performances felt so different from everyone else's. You weren't just listening to jokes. You were watching transformation happen in real time. And the craziest part? Even when audiences knew exactly what Jim was capable of, they still couldn't predict what he would do next. Because every performance felt like it was one step away from complete chaos. And that's exactly what made it so entertaining. And that's where Jim Carrey became different from almost every other comedian. Most performers create characters. Jim became characters. The audience never felt like they were watching someone pretend. They felt like they were watching someone transform. And once people saw that ability, they wanted to see it happen again and again. At least audiences expected Jim Carrey to be unpredictable. Interviewers didn't, and that's usually where things became interesting. Because interviews are built around structure. The host asks a question. The guest gives an answer. And the conversation moves forward. Jim Carrey rarely seemed interested in that system. A simple question could become an impression. An impression could become a character. And before long, the interview wasn't really an interview anymore. It was a Jim Carrey performance. That's what made interviewing him so difficult. Not because he was trying to avoid questions, but because his mind was always moving somewhere unexpected. The host might be talking about a movie. Jim might suddenly start acting out a completely different person. The audience would laugh, the interviewer would laugh, and the original question would be forgotten entirely. Some celebrities answer questions. Jim Carrey transformed them, which is why so many interviewers eventually stopped trying to control the conversation and started enjoying the ride instead. By now, a pattern starts to emerge. Most celebrities treat interviews like conversations. Jim Carrey treated them like playgrounds. Every question was an opportunity, every pause was an opening, and every room became a stage. That's why people never watched a Jim Carrey interview for information. They watched it for unpredictability. If Jim Carrey's physical comedy made him unique, his impressions made him dangerous. Because most people imitate other celebrities, Jim Carrey seemed to become them. A different voice, a different posture, a different expression. And suddenly it felt like someone else had walked into the room. That's what made his impressions so fascinating. They weren't just accurate, they were alive. Jim didn't focus on copying how people looked. He focused on capturing how they felt. The confidence, the insecurity, the weird habits, the tiny details most people never noticed. And once he found those details, he exaggerated them just enough to make audiences laugh. That's why people loved watching Jim do impressions. It wasn't about seeing a celebrity being copied. It was about watching Jim Carrey disappear. For a few seconds, the audience stopped seeing Jim entirely. They saw someone else. And the fact that he could switch between personalities so quickly made it feel almost impossible. One moment, he was Jim Carrey. The next moment, he was somebody completely different. And before anyone could adjust, he'd already become someone else again. That's why interviews with Jim felt so unpredictable, because nobody knew which version of Jim Carrey was about to show up next. At this point, Jim's real advantage starts becoming clear. Most comedians create laughs by saying unexpected things. Jim creates laughs by becoming unexpected things. The audience isn't just waiting for a joke, they're waiting for a transformation. And that's a much harder thing to predict. Kevin Hart attacks reactions. Ryan Reynolds attacks openings. Jack Black attacks boredom. But Jim Carrey attacks reality itself. Because Jim doesn't accept the situation the way everyone else sees it. He bends it, changes it, reimagines it, and then invites everyone else to follow him. That's why celebrities struggle around Jim Carrey. They're trying to have a conversation. Jim is busy creating a completely different world. At least interviewers know they're dealing with Jim Carrey. Other celebrities aren't always that lucky, because sharing a stage with Jim Carrey creates a unique problem. Nobody knows what he's going to do next. And that uncertainty changes everything. Normally, celebrities walk into interviews with a plan. They know the stories they're going to tell, the questions they're going to answer, and the image they're trying to maintain. Jim Carrey has never seemed particularly interested in any of those things, which means the people sitting next to him are constantly forced to adapt. One moment, the conversation is completely normal. The next, Jim is acting out a character, doing an impression, or taking the discussion somewhere nobody expected. And that's when something interesting happens. The celebrities around him stop trying to stay polished. They stop following the script, and they start reacting. Really reacting, laughing, breaking character, sometimes struggling to keep up entirely. Because Jim doesn't just create funny moments, he creates uncertainty. And uncertainty is where some of the best reactions live. That's why so many celebrity interviews involving Jim Carrey feel different. The people around him aren't just participating, they're surviving. And that's exactly what makes those moments so entertaining to watch. By now, the pattern is impossible to ignore. Most entertainers react to the energy in a room. Jim Carrey creates a new reality for the room. And once that happens, everyone else has two choices: keep up or get left behind. That's why even confident celebrities often look surprised around Jim. Because surprise is the one thing nobody can prepare for. For years, audiences thought they understood Jim Carrey. He was the funny guy, the wild guy, the man who could turn any situation into comedy. And something unexpected happened. Jim got serious. And strangely enough, that might have been the most surprising performance of his entire career. Because when the jokes disappeared, people finally got a chance to see the person behind them. The result confused a lot of people. Some expected the same energetic comedian they'd always known. Instead, they found someone asking bigger questions about success, identity, happiness, and what happens after you achieve everything you once dreamed of. For the first time in years, Jim wasn't trying to transform into someone else, he was trying to understand himself. And that's what made these moments so fascinating. Not because they were funny, but because they were honest. The same unpredictability that once created comedy was now creating reflection. Nobody knew what Jim Carrey was going to say next. Not because it would be ridiculous, but because it might be profound. And somehow, that version of Jim was just as impossible to predict as the comedian everyone already knew. At this point, Jim Carrey stops looking like a comedian and starts looking like a mystery. Because most entertainers spend their careers building a public identity. Jim spent years questioning his, which explains why he never seemed comfortable staying in one role for very long. Every time people thought they understood him, he changed again. And that's exactly what made him so fascinating to watch. By now, it's easy to focus on the comedy, the impressions, the interviews, the characters, the chaos. But none of those things fully explain why Jim Carrey feels different. The real reason is much harder to define. Most celebrities spend their careers trying to become something, more successful, more famous, more respected. Jim Carrey spent much of his career asking a different question. What happens when you finally get everything you wanted? And that question changed him. Because the more success Jim achieved, the less interested he seemed in becoming a fixed version of himself. Instead, he kept evolving, changing, questioning, exploring new ideas. That's why Jim Carrey never fit neatly into a single category. Comedian, actor, performer, artist, philosopher. At different moments, he seemed to be all of them. And that's what makes him so difficult to understand. The audience keeps searching for one version of Jim Carrey. But Jim rarely stays the same person for long. Every time people think they figured him out, he surprises them again. Not because he's trying to confuse anyone, but because he's still searching too. And maybe that's why so many people find him fascinating. Because underneath all the characters, impressions, and performances is someone who never stopped asking questions about success, about identity, and about what it actually means to be yourself. That's not something audiences expect from a comedian. And maybe that's exactly why Jim Carrey has remained unforgettable for so long. And that's when Jim Carrey's real secret finally becomes clear. He isn't unpredictable because he tells unexpected jokes. He isn't unpredictable because he creates strange characters. He's unpredictable because he refuses to become just one thing. Most celebrities build an identity. Jim Carrey keeps reinventing one. And that's why people never stop watching. Because no matter how much you think you know about Jim Carrey, there's always another version waiting around the corner. By this point, the pattern is impossible to ignore. Audiences couldn't predict him, interviewers couldn't predict him, celebrities couldn't predict him. And eventually, even the people who thought they understood Jim Carrey realized something. They never really did. Because Jim Carrey was never just a comedian, he was never just an actor. And he was never just a celebrity. He was a performer in the purest sense of the word. Someone who could walk into a room and completely change it. A person who could become a character in seconds, transform an interview into a show, or turn a simple conversation into something unforgettable. That's why his funniest moments feel different. They aren't just jokes, they're surprises. And surprise is something Jim Carrey mastered better than almost anyone. For decades, audiences kept returning for the same reason. Not because they knew what Jim was going to do, but because they had absolutely no idea. And somehow that unpredictability became his greatest talent. Because while other celebrities built careers on consistency, Jim Carrey built one on transformation. Every expression, every character, every unexpected moment, all part of the same thing. A performer who never stopped reinventing himself. And that's why, even today, Jim Carrey remains one of the most fascinating personalities Hollywood has ever produced. Not because he played the same role better than anyone else, but because he refused to play the same role for very long. Most celebrities spend their careers creating a public image. Jim Carrey spent his career escaping one. That's what made him different. He wasn't trying to become predictable, he wasn't trying to fit into a category, and he wasn't trying to give audiences exactly what they expected. Instead, he kept changing, growing, experimenting, and surprising people. That's why his interviews became legendary. That's why his performances became iconic. And that's why celebrities around him often struggled to keep up. Because the moment Jim Carrey entered the room, normal expectations disappeared. A conversation could become a performance could become chaos, and chaos could suddenly become something meaningful. That's a rare gift. And it's exactly why nobody breaks celebrities like Jim Carrey. But while Jim Carrey built his reputation on unpredictability, one celebrity became famous for doing the exact opposite. Because somehow, Adam Sandler became one of Hollywood's funniest people by acting like he never cared about being Hollywood at all.